In Switzerland, let us start nearly on time. I'm Marco Sassoli. I'm director of the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, and I wish to welcome you and thank you for the interest. Obviously, some of you will know that this subject is of particular relevance in Switzerland because there has been an important decision last week of the Conseil National to bring it into the legislation, the criteria under which Switzerland exports weapons. The government wanted to extend the possibility to export weapons and to adapt it to the European practice. Presently, under Swiss law, Switzerland should not export weapons to countries involved in international and non-international armed conflict. The Geneva Academy, many of you know, it is a joint center of the University of Geneva and the Graduate Institute. We have training, masters, we have research projects, in particular policy research, and we are a kind of platform bringing people together, experts, diplomats, practitioners. And one of the things we do are these IHL talks. IHL is International Humanitarian Law, and we are very pleased and thankful to GCSP that we are for the second time have such an IHL talk here at GCSP, and this time very relevant to GCSP because it is about arms transfer. Most violations of humanitarian law are committed with weapons, and a majority of weapons used in armed conflicts are not produced in the place where they are used. Therefore, they are transferred from somewhere else. And at least under international humanitarian law, there are some rather general criteria. States have an obligation to respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law, so they have an obligation, third states, certainly not to encourage violations of humanitarian law, and obviously if a state knows that violations of humanitarian law are committed, giving that state weapons encourages or may even be complicit in violations of international humanitarian law. And even beyond that, there are many measures, obviously, how a state can comply with its obligation to respect and to ensure respect of humanitarian law. I think not to export weapons is perhaps a more direct way than not to import avocados or melons. So this is a way of ensuring respect even when there is no link between the two. And then, and I think this will be the main subject today, and I will not speak about that, there is, fortunately, a specific treaty, the Arms Trade Treaty, in which both international humanitarian law and human rights play a role. On the one hand, in Article 6, a prohibition if a state knows that the weapons transferred would be used in violation of humanitarian law, and Article 7, when that there must be a risk assessment and an evaluation whether weapons could be used in violation of humanitarian law and human rights, and then if there is an overriding conclusion that the risk is too high, the weapons shall not be transferred. I must already apologize that also I would very much like to hear also the discussion. I have to leave in about 1 hour because there's another conference at the University of Geneva. Thank you so much, and thanks to GCSP to host us today, and to my colleague Anissa Belal to chair this meeting, to moderate this meeting, and to the panelists who have accepted to speak at this meeting, and to my doctoral student in Peru who has Carlos Augusto Sibile Rivera, who has helped us, who writes on this very subject and has therefore helped us to organize this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marco, and thank you also for hosting us here. I also want to thank again Carlos, who will be watching us from Peru. He indeed has helped us a great deal in organizing this panel. He should have been the one moderating this, but I have accepted to have this role today in his absence. The IHL Talks are a conversation between panelists. So what I will do is introduce you, the panelists, and then ask you a general question and then a specific question so that we have the possibility to discuss together, and then open the floor to the public for this very interesting and kind of touchy topic, which is the arms trade in view of IHL and human rights violations. So I will start with introducing Ambassador Flores from Mexico. I will say just a few words of each of the participants because their CV are very impressive and very long. But Ambassador Flores is ambassador for Mexico since 2012. She has been the director of international law in the legal office, chief advisor in the Undersecretariat for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights. She has been posted at the Permanent Mission of Mexico in the United Nations in New York, as well as in Vienna. From 2006 to 2007, she was head of the office of the ICC to the United Nations base in New York. And she has been appointed since 2017 a permanent representative of Mexico to the UN here in Geneva. Nina Joyce from Control Arms is a policy and government liaison officer at Control Arms, which is a civil society coalition that works to end the flow of arms and ammunition that fuel conflict, poverty, and human rights abuses. She previously worked in the human rights arena in advocating for education for girls and women, and chaired the NGO Working Group for Human Rights Education. She also has worked for the World Economic Forum and the Financial Times. Nina is a member of the board of directors for Action for Development, an organization that provides public health solutions in Afghanistan. Lastly, our sole representative for once of the men community. We are majority female here, it's good. Tobias Wessner leads the security and law program at the GCSP. He has vast experience in the issue of the arms trade, and in general he was research affiliate and Global Future Fellow at Georgetown University. He was also prior to this position a policy advisor at the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, where he managed political processes with regard to the export of conventional weapons and participated in the UN negotiations of the Arms Trade Treaty. Tobias Wessner holds a Master of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University, a Master's of Laws in International and European Law from the University of Geneva, and a BA in Swiss Law from the University of Lausanne. All that to say that Tobias will also discuss the latest, from a legal point of view, but the latest development that we have had in Switzerland with regard to the arms trade. So, since we are lucky to have a state member of the ATT, a member of civil society, and a legal expert and an expert in policy with regard to the arms trade, perhaps my first general question would be that what are your thoughts about the the advances and the challenges 5 years after the adoption of the ATT, and also with regard that there was lately the Conference of State Parties, I think it was in August of this year. So what are your general thoughts on this, on the ATT and on the latest development with regard to the Conference of State Parties? The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. First of all, I really want to thank the Geneva Academy and the GSP for organizing these talks. I think this is a very important topic, and I'm sure that with all your interest, because there is a lot of work that all of us need to do in our different areas of opportunity, we really have to strengthen the regime. I want to start by saying why Mexico is so much interested in this agenda. You know that for many years, Mexico has been a very active promoter of adopting, reviewing, and strengthening national and international measures to prevent and combat the illicit trafficking in small arms and light weapons. Certainly, we recognize that every country has the legitimate right to preserve their security and their population against any threat and to maintain arsenals for such purposes. But we also think that is precisely security doctrines relying exclusively on the destruction capacity of armed forces that create an unrestrained proliferation of weapons and an uncontrolled market. And that is the highest risk to peace and security worldwide. We have been witnesses in the recent years how international conflicts have escalated, leaving behind millions of civilians dead, injured, or forced to flee their homes. We have seen terrorist attacks committed by non-state actors, killing thousands of civilians and destabilizing regions. And we have also seen an increase in the crime-related violence around the world. That poses a real threat to public security. But we know that in all these episodia, small arms and light weapons are a very important element of destabilization, because the availability of these weapons exacerbate the conflicts, fuel organized crime and terrorism, endanger the rule of law, and contribute to the violation of human rights and international humanitarian law. And this is part of the crisis that we have at the humanitarian level today. This is the common denominator. That is the easy availability of weapons and ammunition of all kinds due to poorly or unregulated markets. And this is why it's very important to strengthen the regime and to ensure that it serves its main objectives. It's calculated that between 45 and 80 million small arms and light weapons are circulating among individuals or groups in the regions without any kind of control. Approximately in Latin America, 80,000 people are killed each year, giving this region by the use of small and light weapons, giving the region the highest rate of homicide committed with firearms. And these weapons destroy, not kill people, but at the same time destroy families, create social and political instability, undermine development and economic growth, and make the democracies more vulnerable. And this is one of the reasons why Mexico has decided to work together with many other partners to try to strengthen and regulate the arms market. And this is why the relevance of the ATT treaty is so important. It's not only for the conflict, it's also, and I want to highlight the importance of national security in terms of the difficulties to face criminal groups in many areas in Latin America, and why it's so important to focus on effective implementation of the treaty and on the regulations and the very specific and careful regulations of the markets, and that will have a very effective implementation of the treaty. But that requires a lot of work, requires a lot of cooperation, and requires a lot of engagement of not only countries, also the private sector, of course, and of course civil society, because civil society is a very important partner for the success of all efforts in this area. So I will stop here, and I can say more things there.
I'm used to moving around when I talk, so I'll try and flap my hands and hold a microphone at the same time. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you today. Always happy to talk about the Arms Trade Treaty to anyone who'll listen. The ambassador's comments resonated a lot with me and with Control Arms. I think we have some of the same mind on many points. The poorly regulated global arms trade and ammunition flows, they fuel conflict, they increase refugee flows, they enable human rights abuses, and they hamper development efforts and increase the incidence and the lethality of gender-based violence. And the Arms Trade Treaty provides an important humanitarian tool for reducing the impact of armed violence and conflict by stopping the unregulated flow of weapons. The ATT is important because it specifically places arms transfer decisions around IHL and IHRL, putting human rights and international humanitarian law at the centre of the arms trade. There are the opportunities from in the Arms Trade Treaty. They are to halt weapons transfers that are used to violate IHL and IHRL. More specifically, through the Article 6 and 7. Article 6 on prohibitions and Article 7 on export assessment and risk assessment. So under Article 6, a state shall not authorise the transfer of weapons if it has knowledge that those arms would violate international obligations or arms embargoes, or would be used in acts of genocide, crimes against humanity, or attacks on civilians. And the prohibitions in this Article 6 are absolute. If a transfer is not prohibited, then under Article 6, then Article 7, a state shall assess the potential that weapons could be used to commit serious violations of IHL or IHRL, or that the arms might be used to facilitate serious acts of gender-based violence or violence against women and children. And the language is very important. The shall and shall not and could are important achievements of this treaty. Ambassador Flores alluded to Mexico's commitment to the treaty. What she didn't say is Mexico was one of those governments that negotiated hard for this language to be included. And actually the language on Article 11 on diversion, Mexico is specifically responsible for that language being included. On Article 6 and 7, this would be the first time in history that states are required to place international human rights and humanitarian law at the core of their arms export decisions. So in that respect, the ATT is built around IHL and IHRL. Get my letters confused in a minute. Gender is important. It's a landmark, I think, topic in this treaty. It's important because the effects of weapons are felt very differently by different genders. So men and boys are more likely to experience death from weapons violence, whereas women and girls are more likely to experience displacement and destitution. Guns are used to maim and kill, obviously, but they're also used to threaten and to intimidate. So they can be used to impose rape as a weapon of war, to coerce women into sexual slavery, or to perpetuate other forms of sexual violence. And even after hostilities end, the weapons that are still available in former conflict areas can be used to commit gun-related femicide and domestic violence. So the point being that there is a link between the risk of gender-based violence and the availability and use of weapons. So that's the logic of assessing the risk of gender-based violence when a country is assessing an export. There are some challenges. I can go into those now, or would you like to come back to those later? Okay, I'll stop there for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Anissa, for the initiative for this panel, which I think is really, really timely, because on the one hand, 5 years after the adoption of the Arms Trade Treaty, the question is, well, what really did change? The answer is not that obvious, but on the other hand, I think it's really now time, 5 years after, really to look at Article 6 and 7. So thank you very much to you and Carlos for the initiative. Also, thank you very much to Professor Sassoli for being here, for launching it. I'd like really to express my excitement that you started as the director of the Geneva Academy, because I was never that close to be able to call me a disciple of his, but I was certainly one of hundreds of students who were not only educated, but also really inspired by his teaching. So, thank you. So, if we go into and look at your question, if I may, and a lot of intelligent and very important things have already been said, but maybe let's try to take a step back and look a little bit of the context of the Arms Trade Treaty, of the context of arms trade, because in the end, there's only so much things that treaties, especially the regulatory treaties and international law in general, can really achieve. So if you look at the main drivers, what are the main elements of international arms trades? I think it comes down to four. So basically you have geopolitics, you have security considerations, you have economics, and you have ethics. If you start with geopolitics, well, it's pretty simple. You can strengthen allies by transferring arms. You can actually hamper influence of enemies by transferring arms to their enemies. When it comes to security, it's pretty simple too. Like with the exception of Costa Rica, as long as states have weapons, other states want weapons to defend themselves, so they will procure weapons. Then the third aspect is economics, and here we're really talking of business. Like on the one hand, we're talking of revenues, of incomes, we're talking of employment, which even in Western countries, with all their moral standards, remain important, and also considerable tax incomes. So it's really the economic part. And the last part, I think, the last element, the last driver is ethics. And here, if you follow a little bit the gun debate in the US, well, you know how the debate goes, right? Is it the gun who kills, or is it really the person holding the gun who kills? And so it's an endless debate, and it goes on and goes on. But even if we agree on, okay, it's the gun that actually kills, well, ethics isn't that straightforward either. Because what you can say then, just to give you an example, well, who is really responsible in the end, and that's why I think it's great that Carlos is doing his PhD thesis on that from a legal point of view. Because to give you an example, when I was working at the Export Control Division, I talked with the CEO of a very successful arms manufacturer. It was small arms, and I asked the person, look, how do you sleep at night? Because basically you're producing these weapons, they're going to conflict-prone regions. How do you sleep at night? And the answer was pretty straightforward. The answer was, I sleep very, very well, because I produce weapons, but I don't authorize the experts. I don't decide where they go. I'm not the expert in human rights. I'm not the expert in IHL. I just produce weapons. So okay, yeah, I got that. So I go to someone who is really high in the pecking order in the food chain of export controls, and I ask, how do you sleep at night? Because I mean, these weapons, they go to these conflict-prone regions, and I mean, of course, we say we know what happens with them, but I mean, really, how do you sleep at night? And the answer was, well, I sleep very well, because, I mean, I assess the situation, I take the decisions, but in the end, I mean, you know, I don't produce the weapon. So I think that is something that is very, very elementary. And I think it's important to understand these four drivers, right? Geopolitics, security, considerations, economics, and ethics. Because if you put the puzzle together, and if you look at the four different elements, well, the chance that if you negotiate a treaty with all these drivers, the chance that this treaty will be very, very strong are really pretty minimal. And the same also applies to implementation when we're talking about that today. So I think that is something to keep into mind. And so what actually really has changed? Or you can just turn the whole system off. Just turn the whole system off. So the mic, yeah, the mic still works. So, okay, great. So I think what is important is that the negotiations and the whole process, however, has had significant results so far. Now it doesn't, I would say, it doesn't concern Article 6 and 7 so far. But what we did had is all states were concerned and had to deal with the challenges of arms trade during the 7-year process of the negotiations. We have now 130 states that have signed, so some way or the other committed to the arms trade treaty. And so also with international assistance projects, what you have is actually you have huge capacity building for new export control systems, for new point of contacts, information exchange, etc. So in the words of Ambassador Griffiths, who is the head of the Secretariat of the Western Arrangement, he says, well, arms exports used to be a taboo. Now it's becoming mainstream. And I think that's something that is really, really important that we have to keep in mind 5 years after the adoption of the treaty. We have really gotten we're not at the stars yet, but we have gotten so far so good. And so the other aspect then is also with the Conference of State Parties, etc., and you witness this really, you are the players there. Well, you have dialogue. You have institutionalized place for dialogue where exporters and importers can talk together. And although that might not mean that much, maybe it might be modest, well, it's pretty significant. Because if you have a discussion between an exporting state and an importing state, and the importing state says, hey, I need weapon, I need to go to war, or I need to fight some terrorists, and the exporting state says, well, okay, you can go get those weapons, but just, you know, like, don't target civilians. I mean, you can kill combatants, but don't target civilians, and, you know, don't torture. If we're not there yet, but if we can get there, I think, and everyone is winner because the exporters, they can export, and the importers, they can import, I think then we're getting somewhere. And that also leads me to another aspect of, in general, the focus is always on the exporting states, and we're getting there with Article 6 and 7, but I think it's also important to really engage importing states, because there are so many states that actually they're really a mess when it comes to weapon. And when they just, you know, like criticize exporting states, that's the easy thing. But maybe try to do your homework, you know, make sure that the weapons are used the way they should be used, and also not diverted to other actors. And so, leading it then to the question, where are we from the title? Conflict-prone regions, Article 6, Article 7, the IHL criteria, etc. Well, I think one thing is really important to say, that the Arms Trade Treaty is not a treaty that bans arms transfers. It regulates arms transfers. So in a sense, what you see oftentimes in the media is, well, the levels of international transfers are really, really high. Well, therefore, the ATT is failing. Well, that is pretty wrong, because the ATT's ambition was never to reduce the arms transfer. So it can go up, high level of international arms transfers. You can have low level of international arms transfers. That is not the point of the ATT. The ATT is to fix certain standards of behavior for decision makers that should ensure Article IHL, the respect of IHL and human rights, etc. And that leads me to Article 6 and 7. Well, what has changed there with regard to IHL criteria, with regard to the respect of human rights? Well, I would argue at this point, and that's why I think this discussion is so important, I think at this point, not that much. Because what you see actually is, number one, there were really good negotiators at work. I mean, I can tell there were smart negotiators, and they knew what they were negotiating. And so if you look at, that's really reflected. If you look at Article 6, Article 7, it's what the diplomats like to call constructive ambiguity, right? It's ambiguous, so we can all agree. Therefore, we can make a historic treaty. But in the end, if you look at Article 6.3, well, I mean, the threshold for this prohibition is really, really, really high. Those of you who are into IHL, if you look at the definition of war crimes, well, it's plus minus the US definition of war crimes, which to any state that had adhered to the Rome Statute must be disappointed. But that's the way it is. Same with Article 7.3. The whole system, how it's designed, gives you such a broad room for interpretation that actually it's hard then to really take the Arms Trade Treaty and to pinpoint to certain decisions. And another fact, if I may say, is also the European countries. Now, the European countries, those that have joined the EU, they also say that, well, the EU common position, that is for the reference document, already fulfills and the expectations, the obligations of the Arms Trade Treaty. Thus, we don't have to change anything. But what that results is not only, we don't even now talk of the big exporting states like Russia, etc., that are not in the treaty, but even the large exporters of the EU and small exporters, many small exporters of the EU, have actually mostly not changed much with regard to legislations, policies, etc. So I think that's really where the discussion today should start, and I also think that that's where the debate should start, and also activism and lobbyism, etc., etc. And I think the UK case on the court's ruling on UK decisions regarding arms exports to Saudi Arabia in the context of the Yemen conflict, I think that is still, although some are disappointed, but it's still a big wow effect. Because basically what you're seeing suddenly is, whoa, the traditional means are getting invoked, and I think that's a great achievement, and that's a great way forward too, because it's like the armed forces of the Brits who say, well, they learned it the hard way that human rights actually mattered. because suddenly, I mean, their operations and their decisions were discussed by judges. And I think that is something that is really, really important. I think here also civil society has pushed a lot, and I think that's really a great advancement. So with that, I think I'll limit it to that, and yeah, give the word back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tobias. So perhaps just in the issue of implementation of the ATT 5 years after its adoption, I was thinking perhaps if you could develop a little bit more the problematic fact that the ATT does not per se prohibits or regulates armed transfers to armed non-state actors. And as we know today, the majority of armed conflicts involved armed non-state actors. So my question to the three of you, again, you know, from each of your perspective as a state, as a representative of civil society, as a policymaker, expert in law, how does the ATT in fact address this issue of weapons ending in the hands of armed non-state actors and perhaps leading to the violations of IHL and human rights law, and how then, what is the contribution to the ATT to this particular issue?
I thank you, Tobias, because I think you said it very well when you talk about the 4 dimensions of the ATT and how we really have to make emphasis on connecting all the dots, and of course with the idea of achieving the objectives. I think when we go to the objectives of the ATT is that to contribute to regional and international peace, security and stability, to reduce human suffering, to promote cooperation, transparency and responsible action by state parties. And of course, for us, the ATT is not just a treaty that provides with a register to say how much I produce and how much I sell and where. Because it's not only to give licenses. This is a treaty that is aimed at achieving those objectives, and that is why the issue of diversion is so important. There is in the ATT one provision that talks about diversion. The ATT, it's recently adopted. It's 2014. It has 98 state parties today, but some more are going to join for sure. And this is just a path of implementation. There are discussions right now to see the best way to implement. But we are not addressing enough, and that's the opinion of Mexico, the issue of diversion, and we have to do that. I think the numbers are very clear when they said how many weapons are diverted and are fueling conflicts. But we need information. We need to have a reliable data to present. I'm going to tell you in the case of Mexico. Mexico has very strict regulations for the possession and acquisition of weapons. Very strict. Only the military are in a position to produce, to import, to distribute, and to provide licenses. It's very difficult that you find those weapons that are regulated in the market. But the number of illicit weapons in the Mexican markets, you can imagine the numbers. Why? Because everything comes from our borders, and this is part of diversion. And we have identified diverted weapons that were legally sold that are now in the hands of criminal groups. So this is an issue that really needs to be addressed. And if we don't address the issue of diversion, we are never going to be able to achieve the objectives of the ATT. So for us, it's not only an administrative treaty, it's not licensing. We really have to make efforts to achieve the objective, because that means that states cannot sell weapons that will be used to fuel a humanitarian crisis, killing and wounding civilians. It also means that no weapons are going to be diverted. And it means that at the end that human rights are above economic interest. And this is the issue. This is the core issue that we need to work. We have several working groups now are starting. What we see is that sometimes the participations on countries affected by conflict are not in the room. They don't have the specific number, and we have to work on that. And I think one of the conclusions of the last conference of the parties is that we need to invest to get reliable data, to make sure that we are going to address diversion. Because if we don't do that, the ATT or any other instrument will be at the end useful for the purposes. And the killing of civilians and violations of IHL and violations of human rights are going to continue. And those people will continue to sleep well because they only issue a paper. No? And they didn't produce, they didn't use it, but at the end is the whole cycle that we need to address.
I would echo those comments. We'd be completely in agreement that more work needs to take place on diversion, and that non-state actors having access to illicit weapons is the fundamental issue here. One of the points of the treaty is to regulate the legal trade as a means to reducing or stamping out the illegal trade. So one big step would be definitely to address diversion and put more resources there.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to echo what has been said before, and I think especially diversion is really an important aspect. So one thing is re-export, because that happens a lot. So you export to one country, and the country then actually exports again to some other country or non-state actors, etc. The other thing is within a state, so it goes to a state, but they lose control, and has been seen in Libya, etc. So non-state actors can get hold of weapons and can use them. And as we know, especially Kalashnikovs, but a lot of weapons actually, they have a long life cycle. So it's not just a question of a couple of years, but it's significant. But coming really answering your question, I think, well, the non-state actor issue to me is really the biggest default of the whole Arms Trade Treaty. I think there are two basic ones, and one is non-state actors, because nothing is explicitly addressed regarding non-state actors, and the other one would be brokering, because we know that brokering plays a significant role in actually diversion and getting away of controls, etc. So anyone who has watched Lord of War, I know it's Hollywood, but unfortunately a lot of things are pretty realistic. So we know that. So with non-state actors, it's the biggest loophole, because we know modern conflicts, we know terrorism, etc., etc., etc. However, the problem was pretty fundamental, that everyone knew during the negotiations that we're never going to put anything on non-state actors in the treaty. So we had a lot of conflict-affected states who really pushed for that, who really said, but this is the biggest issue, we need to push for that. But then also we know that there are certain states that like to send arms and transfer arms to non-state actors when it's in their national security interest. And those states were so strong to then actually say, no, non-state actors is a no-go. And I think that is really the high price that the international community paid for getting the treaty. Now, there are certain states that were very open about it. I think you know which one or which ones they are. There are also other states that weren't that open, but then said, yeah, but industry is also non-state actors, so we don't really have a non-state actors definition, because we transfer a lot to industries, to private industries, and we have to be able to do that. So it was a huge debate and technical debate, but in the end it was clear that it was a no-go. And regarding non-state actors, there, I think, Article 6 applies also, and really has to be thought in, could the weapons be used by non-state actors? Article 7 the same. And the beauty, I think, not only of Article 11, diversion, that's really a big beauty, especially if you think of, it complements actually what you have with the UN Program of Action on stockpile management, etc. But I think the beauty of Article 7 is that actually it addresses indirectly a lot of non-state actors when you're talking of IHL, of serious violations of IHL, international human rights law, but also there's the element of organized crime. There's also the element of terrorist acts. So that is addressed very holistically, but I think still, because the mechanism is not that stringent, not that rigid, not enough. And coming to NSAs, the last point I would just mention, I think a very unfortunate thing is with the Syria crisis now, I think a certain taboo has been broken regarding notably arms transfers to non-state actors. I mean, even Germany, I can remember we had discussions with them like really on a regular basis. I cannot recall that transferring arms to non-state actors would have ever occurred in their mind. And now suddenly with the Syria crisis, states that were not that open about it have started really using that as a tool for of course, for international security. But that has to be debated, so yeah.
Thank you very much. So again, trying to push a little bit more the discussion now with regard to challenges of implementation. One thing that immediately comes in mind is the situation in Yemen. So there has been allegations of crimes against humanity being committed in Yemen. We know that there are arms export to Saudi Arabia. So how can you assess or evaluate this situation from each of your point of view, but perhaps starting with you, Nina? How is the work of control arms taking place in that kind of context?
Well, Yemen is certainly a case that's front of our mind most of the time. Regarding assessing international humanitarian law violations or human rights violations, we don't need to, because it's been done. The UN agencies and our partner NGOs have established that there is evidence of violations of IHL and IHRL. On a positive note, some countries have decided to tighten their controls or to end exports to the warring parties in Yemen. And I want to be specific that we take no sides, that we urge all exporting states to end all transfers to all warring parties. But some states parties have curtailed or ended their exports. We're very pleased about that. But it is very urgent and evident that the implementation of the treaty needs to take place to the full letter of the treaty in the case of Yemen. According to the CIPRI arms transfer database, so for the period 2013 to 2017, exports of weapons to Saudi Arabia rose by 225%, and exports to the United Arab Emirates rose by 51%, making these two countries the world's second and fourth largest importers of weapons. In both of these cases, ATT state parties are among the largest suppliers. The countries are, the United Kingdom and France are the second and third largest suppliers to Saudi Arabia in this period, and France and Italy were the second and third largest suppliers to the UAE. This is according to the CIPRI database. I think if you've been reading the news, you will probably be aware that also Spain has decided to maintain its contractual engagement and continue its agreement to manufacture and export to the Saudi-led coalition. Both the UK and France do maintain that their arms exports to the Saudi-led coalition are closely monitored and that they are consistent with national laws and regulations, as well as with their commitments under other international instruments, and that includes the ATT and the European Common Position on Exports. The challenge in this case is to ensure that treaty implementation is effective. The way the treaty will work effectively is if it establishes new international norms. That is, it's unacceptable to transfer weapons that fuel international abuses. And these norms will be established when more states adhere to the treaty. And these norms will impact states outside the treaty when they cannot transfer arms with impunity. Several governments, state parties have, as I said, ended their transfers to that conflict and are building on this norm. But the challenge is that the countries that continue to export, the largest exporters, are state parties. And again, we would really encourage all states who are exporting to end exports to this conflict. Thanks.
So then, moving away from Yemen, perhaps, Ambassador Flores, you could give us more insight about the situation in Latin America and the challenges that the continent faces. You talked about armed gangs, indeed, the situation in Mexico, but in other countries, like in Brazil, in other countries. So what would be the specific challenges in that region?
Thank you. I mean, the region has been suffering for a long time of this issue of the availability of weapons. There are several regional frameworks that have been approved in the framework of the Organization of American States, where there is a convention on small arms and ammunition. But of course, it has happened the same at the world level, where we have many, including the Palermo Convention, and we have several efforts to reduce the availability of weapons. None of them have succeeded because, unfortunately, the problem continues, and the conflicts are there. And one of the problems is that you really need the engagement of all actors. It is clear, as I said before, that if you don't have the cooperation of all relevant actors, the picture will not change. And that is one of the problems in Latin America. We have almost all Latin American countries, but we don't have all the countries in the continent. If we don't have that, we are not going to be successful. So that is part of the importance of the ATT, because the ATT is a universal effort to try to bring all countries. That's why universalization is very important. There are 98 now, but we need to continue working to make other countries to come. But it's not only to be parties of the treaty, it's to work to accomplish their objectives. Because the objectives, as was said, is not to prohibit, as was mentioned, but it's to regulate, to make sure that the weapons are not going to be there to fuel conflict and to generate more violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. At the regional level, the biggest problems are not armed conflicts, it's organized crime. And organized crime has the power to destabilize countries. Let's look at the Central American countries, for example, and let's see the flow of people leaving violence from those countries. At the end, there is a circle. There is a circle. It's not only the weapons that generate conflicts, and we have to see the mass flux of persons fleeing in Syria, in other conflicts in Africa. And what do you do with that people? You need to apply the international humanitarian framework, and we are seeing what is happening all around the world, given the big movements of refugees and migrants. So at the end, everything is connected. And that is one very important part of the ATT, to try to bring together everybody, to give their space to the private sector, also to give the space to civil society. But we need responsible governments, because if we don't have that, if we don't address diversion, nothing is going to change. So as I said, the ATT, it's a very young instrument. It's working towards implementation, but we need data. We very much need data on the numbers, and we need countries to report. We need countries to report, and we need to try to cover all the loopholes, because as was mentioned, at the end there is a lot of ambiguity that needs to be addressed in the conference of the parties in order to make sure that we all are talking on the same, and we are going to be reporting under the same parameters, and we are going to be taking care of legitimate concerns that can arise on the way. But the issue will not be solved unless we have an effective implementation. And the effective implementation is going to be measured on the effectiveness on the treaty to reduce the availability of weapons that are fueling conflict and are being diverted.
I'll pick up on those comments and echo that the ATT goes much further than simply regulating transfers of weapons, even though that's what it's literally supposed to do. But it also furthers progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, 16.4 on reducing illicit weapons, 11 on making safer cities by reducing the amount of weapons available, and also SDG 5 on reducing gender-based violence and promoting equality. In addition, it would further the resolution, UN Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, as well as the UN Secretary General's disarmament agenda. So the picture is much, much bigger. And on a human level, the responsible arms transfers are a development imperative and a humanitarian imperative. So for every person who dies from armed conflict, many, many more are displaced and left destitute and impoverished. We know the links between high levels of armed violence and poverty, particularly from the illicit trade. And we know that we've seen it in Syria, that the people are losing services through direct damage to infrastructure and unemployment, same as in Yemen. So the challenge of any worthwhile human endeavour and the opportunity is not to lose sight of its purpose. And in the case of the ATT, it's to reduce human suffering.
So, again, coming closer to us now, I would like to have some of your thoughts, Tobias, on the recent debate about the ordinance on materials of war. I don't know if you want to shed a little bit of light of what happened and what would be your take on this.
Well, thank you very much. I don't want to bore you with things that are happening just in Switzerland, but if you're asking, I'm happy to develop that, and maybe it's illustrative for the general reflection, etc. Well, in general, well, in Switzerland you have the exporting, like the criteria that you assess when you want to export. So an exporter, an industry or a firm comes to the authorities, asks, can I export to country X and Y? And then the authorities, they have criteria and they look which, what kind of goods are they, to which end user do they go, what kind of unit, etc. What are the risks? And so the criteria that you have at the national level, the same, pretty similar to the criteria in the ATT, well, they're actually at the ordinance level, which means it's not the law, it's one below the ordinance. So it's the government who has control over the ordinance. Because the basic criteria in the law are very basic. It's just make sure that you have an appropriate industrial capacity and you don't violate international law. That's all there is at the law, which is basically then you can do whatever you want. Now not anymore with the ATT, but initially that's the way it is. And here again, based on the ATT, the assessment was Switzerland doesn't have to change anything. We can just keep the criteria as they are. Now the thing is, because it's at the governmental level that they decide, and in other countries it's often the same, they have even just policies, just political policies, or the Große Koalition, they define some policies or some criteria. So because of it's at the governmental level, what you have, then you have a constant fight of influences, right? So you have the defense industry or the industry that wants export, you have the armed forces that say, no, but we need some kind of certain types of weapons that we produce on our own. You have civil society that comes and says, no, that's not possible. That is just not the right thing to do, etc. So you have constantly this fight. And unfortunately, Professor Marco Sassoli has already left, but I've been in so many working groups. Professor Sassoli has written an open letter on even things that are like just legally wrong currently. But there's this constant debate. And so you don't only have political fights over specific exports and where you send the weapons, but you also have fights over the criteria. So basically you have endless fights, and depending on if the government and the parliament goes a little bit more to the left or a little bit more to the right, you change a little bit. So it's very, it's not very strategic. And what the tendency was, and please just cut me if I'm talking too much, the tendency was, of course, well, Saudi Arabia is a big market. The whole Middle East is a big market. So you had the pressure to say, well, actually, certain countries are just closed because of systematic human rights violations. And the element there is actually then you're saying, well, but the European states, the others, they don't just close the market altogether because of systematic human rights violations. They really look at, is the weapon going to be used to commit human rights violations, which is different, because then you can send like anti-Aryan devices or certain reconnaissance devices you can send to a country that is systematically violating human rights. So there was a lot of pressure to open that market, and so there was a whole debate, and it really looked like actually there's going to be really an ease getting lower standards for the criteria, but it actually fired back. I have not done the assessment yet, what were really the assessments, but the parliament basically said stop. Let's stop this discussion. We actually, the criteria have to be at the law level, at the level of law. So yeah, and I think in the end what the criteria are, I mean, that's a political decision. Political decisions are made in Bern. But I think that is a great move to put it at the level of the law. So So yeah, things. I at least I hope the discussions will stop about, is this criteria right? No, this criteria. Can we, and get into, like, fix it once and for all, put it in the law, and then it's going to be much harder to change the criteria. So what the outcome will be, I don't know. Maybe we're going a step backwards. Maybe we're going a step forwards. That will be up to the political process. Thanks.
Now we have a good overview of all the different issues and challenges and what could be done. Perhaps it's time to open the floor to the public, and I will leave you ask your questions to our panelists. So, yes, sir. And please, perhaps, could you introduce yourself briefly and ask questions rather than comments? Thank you.
Robert James Parsons, independent journalist, historian, researcher. I seek your learned observations on a matter of burning controversy right here and now in Switzerland, namely Ignacio Cassis's effort to open up the flow of arms out of Switzerland to anywhere and everywhere. Switzerland is held up as a paragon of neutrality, even though that neutrality for years now has been honored primarily in the breach and not in the observance, and as testified by its close cooperation with NATO. And the Cassis's position is that because Switzerland is neutral, Switzerland should be allowed to export arms anywhere and everywhere, and all Switzerland should need to do is request that the receiving country not abuse whatever is being sent. And this has provoked an uproar here. Yet Switzerland already exports arms to conflict zones, including especially Israel. It's not a huge, as far as I know, yes. And also Switzerland justifies that, claiming Israel is not at war, yet Israel, before the United Nations, for example, the Human Rights Council, justifies all sorts of abominations by claiming it's a country at war fighting for its survival to defend itself. But anyway, in this case, they want to open this up, and they have a substantial support in the parliament, where a substantial number of the members of parliament are lobbyists for the arms industry because they sit on the boards of directors of the arms companies. And now there is opposition to this, but the idea is simply that because they are a neutral country should be allowed to export wherever it wants. And that runs completely contrary to what you've been talking about, an effort to regulate and even rein in the transfer of arms, and particularly into zones of conflict. Could you tell us, could you speak about this a bit, please? This because owing to Switzerland's status, at least perceived as a neutral country, and its importance on the international stage, this could set a very dangerous precedent in the long run.
Perhaps we take a few questions before answering. Yes?
Thank you. My name is Ibrahim. I was the former ambassador of Yemen in Geneva. Now, this is a very important subject, and I appreciate all the panelists in their introductions. Now, I want to concentrate in one issue on transfer of arms in the time of war situation, especially in the region, which it is very important. I think the treaty has to touch this also if there is a revision, because now it's not only transfer of arms, there is couple of situations. Now you have poverty, you have political situation, you have tremendous violation of IHL. Now I think treaty should deal with this situation in how to educate, how to make the NGOs, media, academia world play a role in this, to give education, how the commanders of the army has to be educated, has to be told about it, how what is has been touched, the economic poverty, this situation. So I think it's very important also that recruiting, children recruiting also in this regard, because it becomes not only a violation of IHL, it becomes only also a big crime, recruiting of children. Now, I have, since Anissa, she mentioned Yemen case, I will not discuss this very much, but I heard that involving regional countries, I haven't heard that role of Iran in this. Iran is very much loaded of especially landmine. Now there is not only trade transfer in Yemen, there is a culture of producing landmine, especially rockets, even through the sea, so which it is all regional powers that are involved in this, sending small children to the battlefield. Instead to go to school, they are going to there, they are educated them how this culture, it means brave. So this is very important also. Now, I will stop here, and I have small Ambassador Flory. Now, she spoke about Mexican experience, Latin American experience. I think this is very important to share at the time of conflict, how Latin America expertise, experience can, time of situation of war, can get benefit of this. And to be that, you touch upon economic business. Yes, it becomes economic because you have smugglers in the sea, in the desert, everywhere. Now, those gang, they will not leave this job. It is big business. It is big. How to deal with the roots of the problem in terms of to end this business and sending people to heaven and violating IHL. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll take a third question, and then we go back to our panelists. Yeah, please, yes.
Hello, thank you. I'm an LLM student at the Geneva Academy, and my question concerns the US exports of arms to fuel the Yemeni conflict. So specifically in the recent, under Trump's administration, actually, there's been a continued down spiral of human rights. When it comes to arm trades, specifically in March 2017, for example, in Bahrain, who is an ally to the Saudi-led coalition to fuel the conflict in Yemen, Trump's administration has removed human rights conditions imposed under Obama's administration to conditions that were included in an agreement on sales of an F-16 aircraft combat. So my question then pertains to the human rights conditions under Trump's administration on sales to allied countries, actually, like Bahrain, for example. So what do you think then is the future of the arms trade treaty under Trump's administration, since I understand that the US is a party to the ATT? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So perhaps the first question, who would like to comment on Switzerland and the arms trade? Tobias, would you want to say something, or?
Thank you very much. I don't. Concerning Switzerland's neutrality, I think what is important is neutrality, especially if we're talking here among international lawyers. Neutrality concerns interstate conflict, and the principle of neutrality there is that, well, you can transfer to one party of the conflict, but to the other one. So here, I mean, that is a guiding principle. That is law. That is neutrality law, and Switzerland tries to uphold that. So that doesn't mean that Switzerland can, just export to anyone just because they're neutral, etc. And I also think that maybe it's a little bit it goes a little bit too far, saying that that the new federal council is the driver of different policies, etc. And what I would like to recall, I mean, I was very critical before. I hope it was objective, but also especially when it comes to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the humanitarian tradition of Switzerland, and that you can, also that Switzerland is pushing also Geneva, etc., I think still remains a guiding principle. Now, it's always hard to come and argue with, our humanitarian tradition tells us that we should not export when you have, as I said, concrete employments, businesses and incomes, etc. On the other side. But I think that the humanitarian tradition for Switzerland complements the neutrality aspect, and I think that is also very important when it comes to non-international armed conflicts, to civil wars and exports that do not go to countries involved in civil wars.
Question on Yemen. I don't know who would like to contribute, or not only Yemen, in fact, but the broader regional context of this conflict, which is indeed, which concerns a vast area of states, not only Iran, but the whole other states involved in the coalition. So who would like to intervene on this? Nina, you would? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and I can comment on the context of the Arms Trade Treaty. So Iran is not a party to the treaty. So our advocacy efforts are on state parties who are members of the Arms Trade Treaty and their transfers. So our colleagues have not seen evidence of live ammunitions from Iran in the battlefield. We've seen battlefield capture and diversion. We haven't seen the same scale compared to the weapons provided by state parties to the ATT. And as I said, Iran is not a party to the treaty, and the major exporters are. I know that answer is not good enough, humanly speaking, but that would be my answer as regards to the ATT.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I echo what has been said, and thank you for the question. I'm not at all an expert of the region, so I can't say anything about the specifics. I think, from my point of view, what is just important is, again, you mentioned the responsibility of the importing state or of different states. How do you form the commanders? Do they know IHL, etc.? I think that is a huge responsibility of importing states, and also the international community can help, like GCSP tries to also help in that sense. And the other, but I think, as I said, the example that I gave before between the importing and exporting state, the dialogue, I mean, it shouldn't be simplistic, but if we can get to a system, and some might disagree with me, but if we can get to a system where actually we can say, okay, arms flow is something that is just inevitable, things will happen, but we just need that exporters and importers both assure themselves that IHL violations are not committed, I think then we would really get, it's very rational, it's very, but I think we would really get a step further. So in a sense that the importing state can acquire weapons and the exporting state can sell weapons, because that's what they want to do. But under the condition that IHL, etc. is respected. And that leads me to the other point of smugglers. Again, I don't know the specifics of the region, but I do think that oftentimes states know what's going on, and that refers me also to brokering, etc. And I'm not criticizing anyone, but just a cautious note, something that has come up in the framework of the APTT implementation is, reaching out to industry. Well, I mean, it sounds great, right? Because the industries, they're the actors, they're the main actors of the thing. But thinking of the smugglers, that's exactly, I'm a little bit cautious, because what you have is, well, the real problematic smugglers and brokers, etc., you're never going to get at the table. However, like the serious industries, you're going to get them at the table. They'll come to Geneva, they'll bring their name tag and their logo, and they'll be friendly. And in the end, because they know that they're subject to export controls for so many years, they know how to play the game. So in the end, that can even give certain legitimacy. But I think the most important aspect, that what I really want to highlight, is the problem there is exactly states that can say, well, talk to the industry. Yeah, and we'll fund some projects where you can talk with industry. But what are they actually doing? They're stepping away, right? You're getting out of your responsibility, because in the end, states decide where weapons go. They control, they decide, they have the information, and even speaking legalistic terms, the ATT addresses all its obligations to states. So I think that is really important also to see some potential downsides of certain initiatives, and just thinking of your smugglers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, following what has been said, I think it's important that decisions to sell weapons are really taken on the basis of the purposes of the treaty. So that means it's just not a simple assessment, but we have to really be clear on the threshold, and we have to make sure that this threshold will be respected. Is not going to be an easy assessment. That means that if there is a conflict and a country is going to be selling weapons, it has to really make an assessment whether these weapons will be in compliance with the purpose and objectives of the treaty. And this is the importance of the Conference of the Parties, to revise how this has been applied and if it's working or not. And I think the best way to do it is by getting information, by discussing, and by having assessment at the Conference of the Parties. So that is something that is going to happen when the treaty starts really coming into that part of revising how effective the treaty has been for achieving the objectives. I just wanted to make also sure on to highlight the importance of education for peace and of training. Of course, not everything is covered by the ATT, but it's covered under the existing regime, where there is an obligation of countries, particularly to train their military on IHL, on human rights, and not only their military, also police forces and in general security parties, they have, when fulfilling their duties, they have to be trained and they have to respect human rights. There are many challenges. I'm not saying that this is done easily, but it's a trend that is there and has to be committed. And just to say, one commercial, but part of the agenda, disarmament agenda of the Secretary General of the UN is precisely trying to put all the dimensions together and trying to reinforce the work among different UN bodies. So I think this is a very important part. People forget, countries forget about the importance of training and education, but this is key if we really want to succeed in implementation of international law.
Thank you very much. And now with regard to the third question, so the US is not a party to the ATT, but it's a signatory to the ATT. However, I mean, and perhaps this is the good moment to make the link with Professor Sassoli's initial remark about the role of other treaties which can be linked to this issue, which is namely Common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions, which is an obligation upon state to respect and ensure respect for the Geneva Convention. So, in your experience, is there a room, for example, with regard to the ATT community, but also from a perspective of a state or a civil organization or policymaker, to also have recourse to other international instruments to encourage states like the United States, which has the obligation to respect IHL because it is a party to the Geneva Conventions, like every other existing state. So could there be a way to encourage such actors, such important states to respect? You've talked about the object and the purpose. I think that here it can be discussed whether or not such a massive export to Saudi Arabia is really in compliance with the object and purpose of the treaty, and as a signatory of the treaty, it can be discussed whether or not it's complied with the object and purpose of the treaty. But apart from this, is there a possibility to use other instruments to encourage states to respect ATT, the spirit at least of the treaty?
I'll just do the start now that I want to monopolize. But so I think it's a really interesting question. On the one hand, I mean, Americans in the room might have probably more insights than I do, but I don't think that at least in my opinion, or what I assess, that the exports from the Trump administrations are so much different from the exports of the Obama administration. And I think, especially when you're certain transfers, especially non-state to non-state actors, well, in Washington they have a strong understanding of national security, and what they perceive in their national security interests, they will do. So I think that maybe is something different from more smaller states that are used to not be able to pursue their interests that that independently as the U.S. But to respond to your question, I think there are different instruments. However, I'm not sure that different instruments are that helpful, which on the one hand can explain why the ATT as such has evolved, because there was a need for an ATT. But the first would be Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions, respect IHL and ensure respect. And so there's the argument that under that ensure respect, you can actually say, okay, so you can't actually transfer weapons when you know that, or there's a persistent pattern that the weapons will be used to commit violations of IHL. Now, I did not write a PhD thesis on that, I must admit, but I just can say that the ICRC worked a lot with that argument during the negotiations, and at least, I mean, I didn't talk with everyone, but most of the state representatives were like, no, I mean, nice, but that's not state opinion, that's not state practice. Now, again, I didn't do the research, maybe it is, etc. I'm not judging, but that was the opinion. So I think we're not on a strong basis there. Then you also have the UN Program of Action on Small Arms, which is also an element that plays into a role. You have the International Tracing Instrument, etc., that complements, but they're not as explicit. I mean, the UN POA anyway is politically binding, it's not legally binding, and they're not that explicit about arms transfers. So then you have regional instruments. Again, UN Common Position, for instance, they're pretty strong. That's a major thing. Other than that, I'm not aware of instruments that are as strong as the ATT. And then, however, I think the important thing, if we're linking it to the US, is a little bit in the sense that in their understanding, they already comply with the ATT. So they said they negotiated the ATT so that they were already in compliance. Their export control system is the gold standard, and they're already in compliance. So they will reject any claim that their exports is violating the object and purpose of the treaty, which has to be debated. But the other thing, however, which could be interesting. And we're not there yet 5 years later, but in the end, if you have the treaty that is black letter, how it was negotiated, but you have major actors like the US who are not actually state parties, well, I mean, the whole way that the state parties do the interpretation, how they look at Article 6.3 and especially Articles 7 and 3 with the overriding question, you know, when in the end does it trigger that you can't export? Well, if you can have an established practice of how that is implemented, well then actually you can suddenly then come up and say, well, the treaty has evolved in practice, and thus actually maybe you can make the argument, well, the US is not in compliance anymore with how the treaty regime has evolved. And Norway, for instance, has clearly said that the way that they see overriding, if there are overriding negative risks, you know, basically it's a balancing, positive risk versus negative risk. But they say, no, it's a substantial. If there's a substantial risk, like in the EU common position, they will not export. So that is contrary to the treaty text. But if this group of like-minded states that are state parties, you know, apply it that way and develop a state practice and stick to the language and to the legal justification, it might evolve over time. And that's why I'm saying also 5 years after the adoption of the treaty, I think it's elementary to address these questions.
Yes, well, I think it's for these instruments to be effective, it's important that all interested countries and particularly those countries that produce and sell weapons are parties. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to achieve the objectives. That means that the work on universalization of the treaty is very important, and we have to keep the dialogue with all countries. Particularly, of course, in the case of the US, is very important because they are a producer and a seller, and of course, many of the weapons that have been diverted can be found in different conflicts. What I just want to highlight, in addition to the importance of the work towards universality and towards keeping dialogue open to try to bring all countries to the ATT, is as well the importance of information. We need to have reliable data to make sure that we are understanding the challenge, because it's easy for a country to say, yes, I comply with the rules, I always make the checks, I make the assessment, and that's it. And I just sell to good guys. But when you go to the ground and you see the number of weapons diverted, then you have the data to go and increase the dialogue and say, well, something is not working because these weapons were found in this area. So we need really to enhance the transparency, we need to enhance the reporting, and we need to have data, clear and verifiable data, because this is something that we don't have now. We just have some NGOs and civil society are reporting on certain facts, but we really need to have data, we have to have broader, we have to make sure that we are able to analyze those data and to identify the solutions. Because otherwise we are going to be talking, yes, I comply, no, you don't comply, yes, but we need really to continue working on that. And that's a very important avenue of the ATT that continues to be developing, because it's now starting. The discussion is now starting. So it's encouraging, but still we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you very much for organizing an amazing event. And my name is Solomon. I'm a conflict prevention trainee with the UNDP. And my question is mostly focused to Tobias in regards to the ATT Article 6 and 7. I think Article 6 is mostly negated by the UN Security Council, whereby you're going to need especially like sanctions or embargoes for states not to export in most cases. And then Article 7 asks countries to do their own assessments, in which case we see in Yemen that countries will not really follow the IHL rules, it will follow their self-interest. And what's the way forward in this case to address this kind of dilemma? Thank you.
Hi, thank you for organizing the event. I'm Alexis. I currently work with the ICRC. I'm also a graduate of the academy. My question is on some elements of armed transfers that are not directly covered by the ATT, but have been touched upon a little bit, and which actually do have a big impact on populations affected by armed conflict, namely training that could be attached to arms transfers, because often the way arms are used, for them to be used in accordance for IHL, they need to come with adequate training, and also the nature of weapons to be adequate to the situation at hand. For example, explosive weapons with a wide range to be used in populated areas. So I wanted to know how you see yourselves able to engage on those problematics, either at a diplomatic level, Ambassador Flores, or as civil society actors, and how you see those as important or and linked to the discussions around the ATT as well.
Thank you. I actually had two questions, but I'll just ask one of them. My name's Jennifer Philpott-Nissen. I'm with the World Council of Churches working on human rights and disarmament. We've talked about the links with the ATT and human rights, but I also wanted to talk about the mechanisms of the human rights system. When I started working on disarmament just over a year ago, I noticed that a handful of countries, a very small handful, were regularly using the Universal Periodic Review to push countries to concerning their obligations, or to sign and ratify the Arms Trade Treaty. That included Guatemala was one, Uruguay, New Zealand, just a few others. So my plea to you, Madam Ambassador, is whether you would consider this. I know that Mexico has been very consistent using the Universal Periodic Review for the rights of people with disabilities. Please don't stop doing that. But I have timed it. In the 2 minutes that you get to speak, you can in 10 seconds, you can encourage a country to sign, ratify, and implement the Arms Trade Treaty. And that gives us, as civil society, a really great tool if you've just made those words in the Human Rights Council. So that's my plea today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy that you asked me the question that I really don't know how to answer. It's challenging and maybe also disappointing. But like regard to Article 6, I agree with you that Article 6.1, is just reflective of the standard practice already, concerning sanctions. Article 6.2, the same thing with already existing obligations regarding, cluster munitions and other conventions. However, Article 6.3 does have the strict and straightforward, not straightforward, I'm sorry, but strict prohibition regarding war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Again, as I said, there's the debate of, how high is the threshold really, and the element there is really the question with knowledge. So a state has to have knowledge that the weapons will be used in the commission of the crimes. Well, the knowledge, does it mean like what we're knowing from the ICC, etc., constructive knowledge, like should have known, or I mean like should know, or should know, or must have known? Or is it more like actual knowledge, like that the weapons will be used like that? Well, if it's actual knowledge, it's basically, it's impossible to have actual knowledge, and I would suggest that those states that have actual knowledge that their weapons will be used to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity, etc., they'll stay far away from the treaty. And others, they will never. That's a bit high threshold. Now Article 7, as we said, I don't know. It's really hard, as you're saying. So much is still possible, and the UK judgment has shown that so much is still possible with the current formulation, and that's why I'm saying one way out could be an evolution of treaty interpretation and the developing practice. Another thing is, I think that's what civil society did very well, challenging certain export control decisions in court. I guess, or I'm pretty confident that in many countries, actually, that's not even possible to challenge through the judicial, actually, export control decisions. So there, try to change legislation. I think that is really important, and then really talk about it, like the whole monitoring aspect. I think it's really important, which also links to UPR. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So another question was linked to the broader impact, or perhaps the role with regard to training on weapons, or what could state or civil society do with regard to the use of explosive weapons, so certain weapons, and what would be the role of state or civil society in that regard. Who would like to comment, Ambassador Flores?
Well,
no?
Yes, simply to say that we are also part of several, with other delegations and civil society, trying to increase awareness of the use of explosive weapons and the effects on population, and trying to request countries, when they make the assessment of the use of specific weapons, that they really have to take into account the effects and the impacts on civilians. Let me tell you that it's not easy because it's the same, it's an assessment. And then you are faced with countries that says, yes, we do the assessment, but still there are casualties. But I think it's now very clear that this is an issue that needs to be addressed, because at the end, if you are using these weapons with very clear effects into civilians, you are destroying cities, you are making people to leave, you are exacerbating conflicts, and it's part of the same. It's part of the same problematic that we have all over the world. So yes, there are efforts. This is not done in the framework of the ATT, but there are several spaces within particularly within the Convention and the prohibition of certain weapons, that we are having conference of the parties. There is not a single view on this. There are lots of interpretation, but the answer is that yes, we are trying to do that. We are doing working with other countries and also with civil society, and we hope that at least we need to have a very clear political declaration saying that weapons with effects should not be used in populated areas. But it's an ongoing process. The same we do in the Human Rights Council. Let me tell you that we try many times, and we try to include language on specific resolutions asking countries not to continue selling weapons to areas of conflict. We never succeed, unfortunately, but we constantly do that, and we do it working as Mexico and also with other countries. And this is something that we have to keep repeating, but be sure that we will continue to do that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to know if any of you would like to add something. Yes, Tobias?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just to our ICRC colleague, I think it's a great point where you're saying linking IHL training, etc., to weapons exports, and I think that's something that can be even found as mitigation measures under the Arms Trade Treaty. So it can be mitigation measures, and that's I think that can be a very interesting tool in a sense that exactly what we're saying, like you comply with IHL, thus an export is possible. And making exports dependent on that. Now, to my knowledge, but please compliment me, that is not being done yet. That has not been mainstreamed yet. And like GSP would, like is also thinking of things like that. What I know is that coalition partners, with the coalitions in the Middle East, that they make direct military support dependent on IHL training. So I think if it's done there, I think that could be done also in this context. But I think. And then also GCSP is we're starting to do that now with private military and security companies, like having training in a sense, how can you avoid direct participation in hostilities? Because again, here, the idea of, well, they want to do business, there's a market for their service, but we want to ensure that it's done the right way. So I think that's really it's a good idea, but I think it really has to be propagated, and states have to be willing to accept it and really include it into their calculus, and eventually also provide funds to then do so. But yeah.
I could comment on our colleague's question from the WCC regarding the UPR. I think from the point of view of civil society, it's a wonderful avenue to raise that issue. And from our perspective, it's a question of capacity on civil society. Sometimes for resource reasons, we're forced to remain in our silos. But you've touched upon a wider issue, which is synergies. I'm not sure the disarmament world is doing a great job, at least from my personal standpoint, of crossing over and talking more about human rights, etc. It's we did talk about the SDGs as an hour-long session at the end of a 3-day-long meeting. I'm not sure we're there yet at really integrating these two areas of work. The will is there, but the time and constraints do impose themselves.
Let me thank on our behalf our panelists. I think we had a very comprehensive and challenging views on the Arms Trade Treaty. As you said, we are at the beginning, more or less, of the process, so let's hope that the challenges that you highlighted with countries such as Yemen, but also with regard to Switzerland and the US and other countries, France, UK, will move us forward with regard to this issue. So thank you very much for accepting